Hello and welcome. This is Sadhusman. In today's video, I'm going to discuss about pivot tables. Pivot tables are one of the most powerful and useful features in Excel. With very little effort, you can use a pivot table to build good-looking reports for large data sets. It is generally said that outside of a spreadsheet, dog is a man's best friend. Inside of it, a pivot table. Without having to input any formulas, you can look at the same data from many different perspectives. You can group the data into categories, break it down into years and months, filter the data to include or exclude different dimensions, and even build charts. The beauty of a pivot table is that they allow you to interactively explore your data in many different ways with just simple clicks. Let's create a pivot table. The data that we have in this file is in the data sheet, and the data is comprising of various dimensions of order ID, order date, channel, and so on and so forth, sales values, order quantities, and the profits, and so on. So we are going to analyze this information and using a pivot table. But before we create a pivot table, the first requirement is to have the data in the right order. In this case, we need to ensure that there are no blank columns inside of the data, and there are no blank rows as well. The first row of the table has to be the table headers, and immediately after from the next row the data should start. So to create a pivot table, we will click anywhere on the data and we will go to Insert tab and click on Pivot Tables. We have this another option called Recommended Pivot Tables as well. If we click on this, the Excel will itself analyze this information, and based on the data it will suggest some pivot tables from its own. But in this case we have to create a new pivot table from scratch. That's why we will click on Pivot Table. In this case, the data, all the contiguous range is selected from data A4 till 15,004, which is the data range. Window gives us two options to locate our new pivot table, either in the new worksheet or in the existing worksheet. If I click on the new worksheet, it will create a new worksheet and then it will create a pivot table inside of it. What I want is I want to create my pivot table in the second worksheet that I've already created. So in this case, I am going to click on existing worksheet, and on the location I will click on this button and I'll go to this another worksheet and click on a blank cell, and here I will choose to create my pivot table. When I click OK, I will have this window of the pivot table, that is the pivot table area. On the right hand side you can see the pivot table field pane. In this pane we have 5 different areas. The pivot table fields pane is empty at this point because there is nothing. I don't have any information inside of this. But on the left side you can see that from the data, all the data headers, all the field names are available, and you can use any of the field names to create your pivot table. To build a pivot table, we have to drag the fields into each of these filters, rows, column, and values areas, and based on our requirement we can create our pivot table. For example, if I just click on sales and drag it to the values section, the pivot table will just give me a sum of those sales values without any further information on this. This particular sales value represents the total sales value in the data sheet, and coming from this column sales. This information is not very exciting because we have not analyzed in any manner. Let's say if I want to analyze the data with respect to channel, so I can use this dimension channel and I can drag this into the rows section of the pivot table, and when I do this I can see the channel wise sales, the same sales broken into different channels. You can see that the number formatting is not correct. So what I can do, I can click on the sum of sales, go to value field settings, and then click on number format, and then format it accordingly. Click OK, and there you go, the number formatting is done. In this case you can analyze this information based on the channels, but if I want to summarize it by product categories and click on the rows section, you will see this pivot table which basically shows you the sum of sales values for each of the product categories. Once we have the pivot table ready based on the product category, we can do some transformations and some changes inside of the pivot table. For instance, I can change this default calculation of sum to average. To this, if I want to calculate the average of sales for each product category, I can easily do so by clicking on sum of sales, value field settings, and in this case you can see that the value field is summarized by the calculation of sum. We can change this to the average. In this case, average sales of each product category is now appearing. I also want to change the heading of my column. Instead of average sales, I would like to just mention it as sales. To do this, either I can click on this value field settings and click here on name and delete average off. But when I click OK, I will run into an error because it says the pivot table field name already exists. This sales column is already existing in our data. The pivot table does not allow us to have the same name in the pivot table. Just to have a workaround, we can either add a blank space in the beginning or at the end of this word sales. I'm going to add a blank space at the end and I will click OK. Then we have the sales values appearing, average sales values appearing in this column sales. I can also sort this pivot table based on ascending or descending order. To do this, I will click on row labels, more sort options, and then I want to sort ascending based on, not based on product category, but based on sales. So in this case, if I click OK, this pivot table is now sorted in ascending order based on sales, average sales values. Similarly, if you want to sort it based on descending order sales values, I will click OK, and then it is now from highest to lowest. Another thing which I usually do on my pivot tables is to change the layout. This layout of the pivot table is called the compact layout. We can change this to other layouts. For that, we can go to the pivot table tools design tab, and the report layout section. You can see this is already selected, show in compact form. This pivot table layout is called the compact form. There are other forms of pivot table as well, but before going into other forms, I will have to add one more dimension in the pivot table to show the difference. Let's add a product subcategory here, and in product subcategory you can see that the product category and subcategory are both added in the same column A. So this is the compact form of the pivot table. I can change this to other form. To do this, I will go to the design tab, and in design tab report layout, I can select, let's say, show in tabular form. In tabular form, you can see now that the product category and the product subcategory are now in different columns, column A and column B. And similarly, I can also choose to have show in outline form. If I do this, although the columns are different, but there are slight changes in the layout. Personally, I like the tabular form, so I'll choose tabular. And in this case, you can also add subtotals for each product category. To do this, I will click on anyway the pivot table, go to design tab again, and in case of subtotals, I'll show all subtotals at bottom of group, and then you can see the subtotal of product category over here. In this case, this is the average of sales. Let's change this to sum, and then we can analyze further. If I click on sum of sales and again change the name, so I'll just change the name from sum of sales to sales, and if I click OK, I can have the sales value of each product category as well as subcategory available in the pivot table. And now I can also have this subtotal of sales of each product category. This one additional layout, which is called a classic pivot table layout. I'll go to this by right clicking and go to pivot table options, and in this case we go to display and select this, check this classic pivot table layout. This enables the dragging of fields in the pivot table grid directly. Let me show you how it's done. When we have chosen the classic pivot table layout, I can directly pick the fields from the pivot table and drag and drop over here. For example, I want to take out product subcategory. I can just drag it and drag it outside of the pivot table to deselect it. And then, for instance, I want to add manufacturer. Then I'll just take manufacturer from the pivot table field list and drop it on the pivot table grid directly. And there you go, I can have manufacturers here. We have a selection in manufacturers. I will click on this and click all. Now we have the sales for each product category as well as manufacturer. You can see that these cells below the heading of computers is blank. These cells are blank. We can choose to fill these cells as well, so that we can perform some VLOOKUP or some other lookup formulas on this pivot table directly for further analysis. In this case, we can do this by going to design and going to report layout, and in this case we can choose to select repeat all item labels. If we do this, all the item labels will will be filled in the pivot table. So we have created a pivot table, and we have input various fields in the pivot table and made different types of reports. One more thing which I would like to explain over here is the filters area. This filters area is applicable on the pivot table below that on a global level. If I want to take product category to the filters area and then product subcategory down here, and if I leave out the manufacturer, so I have the product categories all selected in the filters area and only product subcategories down here. If I choose to filter out any particular product category, let's say computers, if I select one category from here and if I click OK, automatically the pivot table will align itself based on this filter applied on the filter section. I can choose multiple items in this filter section. Let's say by clicking select multiple items, I select computers as well as TV and audio, and then you can see automatically the pivot table down below is updated. I can also choose to have multiple fields in this area. I can choose to have manufacturer in this category. Now I have manufacturer in case of each of the product subcategories. I can have manufacturer in the columns area, and now I can have a horizontal layout of the pivot table. I have product subcategories in the rows and manufacturer in the columns, and I have product category in the filters area. I can also choose to show or hide the grand total column here. We have grand totals applicable for each of the rows and for each of the columns. Let's say if I don't want to show grand total for the rows section, then I will just right click on the grand total and click on remove grand totals here. In this case, the grand totals are removed and only grand totals for each of the columns are shown here. We can choose to show or hide grand totals in the design tab. If I go to design and click on grand totals, we have four options: off for rows and columns, on for rows and columns, and toggle between rows and columns. For instance, in this case, we can show grand total for both rows and columns by clicking on this, and similarly we can hide grand totals for both rows and columns by clicking on this. So in this case, no grand total is visible here. Finally, I will just choose to have one grand total for each of the columns. Let's click on for columns only. So we have created pivot table, and we have done some basic formatting. We have done some basic changes to the layout and all. Finally, I would like to show you how to format a pivot table. In case of pivot table, when you click on somewhere on the pivot table tools appear in the menu, in the ribbon. And in case of design, you can see that certain pivot table styles are available. If we click on this down arrow, you can see there are light styles, medium styles, and then there's a category called dark styles. So you can choose, and when you hover your cursor on any of the style, you can see how will it look like when you click on any particular style. Let's say if I choose this light green pivot style medium 14, then you can see that the pivot table is formatted accordingly. You can choose to design your own layout by clicking new pivot table style, and in this case this Excel gives you a lot of options for formatting for the whole table, for the report filters, first column, first row, and so on and so forth. So you can choose to format your design your own layout, and then you can save it under a new name, and this new name will be then appearing in this design tab. There will be a section at the top here by the name of custom designs, and then you can choose your custom design on any pivot table that you want. So this is all in this video. I hope you would have enjoyed this video, and thanks for watching.